Let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Melanie Jeffs, the slightly confused publisher here at Crwth Press. These are the authors and illustrators, the real voice of the company. They are going to be telling you how to tell a good story today. I'm just going to quickly introduce each of them, and I'll ask them to wave when I say their names. Kristen Butcher. Kristen, can you wave? Oh, maybe Kristen can't hear me. Oh, there she's waving. There's a delay. All right. Lorraine Kemp. There's Lorraine. Eileen Holland. K.L. Denman. James McCann. Laura Langston. Melanie Jackson. And Emma Pedersen. Thanks for joining us here at our first Facebook Live event. We're going to start with Kristen Butcher because this whole thing was her idea, so she gets to go first. And Kristen's book, Isabel's Stanley Cup, was the first children's book that Crwth published, so it's a fitting start. Kristen also has a book coming out in the fall called The Druid and the Dragon, and I'm just going to share with you all some pretty covers. So Kristen, since we're at the beginning, let's talk about the beginning of the process. Can you tell us a little bit about what kind of planning you do? How much do you do? How little? I know you have an interesting process there, and I'm going to take you off mute so you can answer.
Okay. First of all, I have to say that writing is fun. If it wasn't fun, I wouldn't do it. But it's also a craft, and so it has a process, and as a writer you have to have specific skills and tools that you use to make a story happen. So it's kind of an odd dichotomy, a combination of logic and analysis and skills combined with wonder and magic. And for me, that turns out to be a really good thing because I seem to have both those things in equal amounts. Story ideas come from various places for me. For instance, Isabel's Stanley Cup came from watching Hockey Night in Canada. And The Druid and the Dragon came from just having a title and thinking, I'm sure there must be a story to go with this. And so the ideas come from all over the place, but once the idea arrives, then I have to start writing. And I always have a problem. I don't mean I personally have a problem, but when I start to write a story, my character has a problem. And that's how I write a story. What is the problem? How does it get solved? Could be positively, could be negatively, doesn't matter. But then I start to write. But I always have a plan. I know where I'm starting. I know where I want to finish. And I kind of know some of the stuff that's going to happen in between. And I am a planner. I create a plot. Short, it's not, you know, my outlines are not lengthy things, but I do make an outline. But I don't put in what scenes are going to happen or anything. I just know the things that need to happen so that when I get to write, then that's when all the magic happens. And I get really excited because I don't really know what's going to happen either until it does. I put my characters in a scene and then I jump around from this character to that character to that character. And I think it's going to go this way. And then all of a sudden it goes this way. And I'm as excited and surprised as anybody. It's kind of like I'm reading the book for the first time. I'm the very first reader of the book because I don't really know all of the things that are going to happen until I actually get writing them. So it's magic.
That's great. Thank you, Kristen. It is magic, this thing that happens. I love working on books. So storytelling has many layers and takes many shapes and forms. And our next speaker, Lorraine Kemp, is the illustrator for the second children's book Crwth Press published. It's called Growing Up in Wild Horse Canyon, and this book tells the story of the Okanagan from the perspective of a tree. So telling a story of a region has unique challenges. And I'd like to stay for a moment on the themes of beginnings and ask Lorraine, how you used illustration to convey the beginning of the narrative in Growing Up in Wild Horse Canyon. And wait until I've unmuted you to speak. Okay, Lorraine, I think I've unmuted you.
Okay, and is there an illustration that you have?
There sure is. Here's the cover of the book. And here's the first illustration.
Right, so here in the illustration, this is actually the fourth illustration in Growing Up in Wild Horse Canyon, not the first, but the first were setting up the backdrop in history, when and where this whole story took place. Karen Audio, the author of Growing Up in Wild Horse Canyon, worked really closely together on devising each illustration and all the things that went into it, which, by the way, is a very rare occurrence that an illustrator and an author would work so closely together. But we both had areas of expertise that we could use, and we had to use them together in order to do it. So, beginning here, the story, as you said, revolves around the life cycle of the ponderosa pine. This little foal shied and jumped over the pine tree that is a seedling at the moment. So there's a lot of beginnings in this illustration. Beginnings, of course, the pine tree is just a seedling at this instance, and the foal is very young, but it's springtime. So there's vibrant colors, there's greens, there's arrowleaf balsam root that's now just out, and the ground is fertile and moist. And so that's how I conveyed the beginnings. There's lots of potential for growth in so many different areas. So that's, it was important for us to start off with a bang, with a little bit of action, with a foal. Of course, kids love to see baby animals, and action is always a fun way to start it off. So that's how we decided on this illustration.
Great, thank you. That illustration is lovely, and it has such great kid appeal. I mean, who doesn't like pictures of baby animals? But this regional history had a lot of details that maybe were less kid-friendly. And I'm just curious to hear you talk about how you took some of the scenes from the story and made sure to keep kids engaged.
Well, here's a scene from the very beginning. Kids were involved with this scene because they're actual models that we took from Census Houston School, and we set them up and we told them, we dressed them up. I made the clothes and we dressed them up and we staged them. But kids love to see other kids being involved in whatever, history, action, whatever. So here you have a berry picking, is a berry harvest. A First Nations family is involved with picking Saskatoon berries. Now, Saskatoon berries are an indigenous berry here, so a lot of the locals will understand that. But kids are being normal kids. It's a historical scene, but the kids are being normal kids. One is picking, one is not. One is helping himself to the berries. The baby, of course, is helping himself to the berries as well. When the dog is looking over the baby, and the mother is doing her own thing, gathering sap from a pine tree. And of course, the horse is standing obediently as it was trained to do. So there's lots of areas of different activities within this illustration. So kids can kind of zero in on one and then move to another and look at the background. I have the composition that leads you from the little baby and the mother along the path into the background, and it kind of is a circular motion with the illustrations. So it was important for me to keep the eye active and kids engaged, and kids like lots of activity and lots of things to look at and talk about. And so that's how I devised this illustration.
That's great. Thank you, Lorraine. So we're going to talk next to Elleen Holland, who is the author of our third book that Crwth Press has published. She's the author of Sophie Trophy, which came out last spring, and Sophie Trophy 2, which came out this spring. So Elleen, one of the things people are very often curious about with writers is how they get their ideas. So can you talk about the idea for Sophie Trophy, how it came to you, and then how you went on to develop the character? And I have to unmute you. There you go. Thanks.
Great. And you've probably got pictures of both books. My first book, Sophie Trophy, was based on something that happened to me when I was teaching, I think, at either a grade 4 or 5 class at Ranch Park Elementary in Coquitlam. 2 girls suddenly cried out, Mrs. Holland, there's a spider lowering itself into your hair. And of course, you know, everyone gasped, and I stepped back just in the nick of time, and the spider came down. The moment caused great hilarity in my classroom. My students really enjoyed it, and lots of jokes made for the rest of the day. Several weeks later at bedtime, I have this thing that happens where I'm in my transitional state between wakefulness and sleep. And I realized, you know, I was half asleep, and I started thinking, without even being aware of it, that about how a humorous book could be built around that spidery moment. So luckily, I had written down my story on a scrap of paper. Here is the scrap of paper, an NHL daily calendar. I wrote on both sides in the tiniest print because that's the only paper that was in my bedside table. And luckily I wrote that down because for sure I wouldn't have remembered it the next day. I've done that before. I had an amazing idea, not written it down. But luckily this time I did. And at this point, I had some positive comments about manuscripts I'd sent to other publishing companies. And I knew that I had a good idea now, but I needed a unique main character. I was on the right track. I just had to get this character right. I envisioned a child who was funny and dreamy, imaginative, really imaginative, but that wasn't enough. Thinking back to all the students I had taught over a 33-year career, I realized that the characters that I was thinking of were characters who had ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Most of the kids I was thinking about had that issue, and not one single child did not stick out for me, but sort of the general idea of having that and being in a school setting. Could Sophie, my main character, get into trouble at school? Does a main character do that in an elementary book? As a career elementary school teacher, I realized there was a whole group of kids who needed their voices heard in children's books. Why couldn't an ADHD student be a main character? They were often bright, sometimes really actually quite brilliant in certain aspects of their lives. But they had problems sitting still in the classroom. That didn't make school as easy. They had impulsive behaviors. They'd slide a book out in the middle of a lesson and miss half the lesson because they were reading, or hopefully I'd catch them before that, but they might have collections of baseball cards, hockey cards, Pokemon cards, anything of that sort, and they'd be sneaking a look at that when they were supposed to be listening to the lesson. They'd be like fixated on drawing, and you couldn't get at the written word out of them because they wanted to draw. Or they were waiting for gym class. They had sort of a fixation on sports, and they just kept edging farther and farther off their seat, and they were not paying attention the last 20 minutes before that gym period. So those are sort of interesting behaviors, and I know about some of these kids and what they've gone on to do, and I'm so proud of them. A lot of them have just had, they've figured out their way. So a light bulb lit up, and I made Sophie all of those things, fixating on things, getting behind in class a little bit, acting impulsively. I made her imagination run wild very often, and I made her really dreamy. And that dreamy thing and the imagination thing actually was right from me, because as a child I would get behind. I wouldn't get behind. I would miss things in a lesson for the part of a lesson, because I would think of something and start dreaming about that, the bird in the tree, or something I saw one of my students doing, or something that someone was wearing, and I'd think about that, and then have to force myself over the years, up to about the end of grade 3, I had to say, hey, you can't be doing this, you're missing too much. None of my teachers ever complained. I didn't get in trouble in school. I just didn't. But I thought of the same things probably that Sophie Trophy does. I just didn't do them. I didn't act on them. Thinking of that, how, dreaming in the early grades, I made Sophie know what was right. And sometimes she would know she was right, and other times she would not be able to control herself at all. Sophie doesn't intend to do the wrong thing, and she doesn't intend to upset people, but sometimes those things happen in the book. And for example, when Sophie reaches out and touches the first bloom of Haley's, the new girl Haley's show and tell cactus, a beautiful bloom, she is drawn by the beauty that makes her pretty much color dizzy. I can relate to that. And when she touches it, she is lulled into a delirium by its softness. She certainly has no idea of snapping that bloom off. And unfortunately, that's the sort of thing that her impulsive behavior leads to. The idea for Sophie Trophy 2 started with the notion that kids love flashlights. There's the flashlight that Sophie ended up with. She really, really had another color dizzy moment when she saw the beautiful color of it. Very, very happy about that. So Sophie, I figured, I was thinking of different flashlights, and I figured Sophie could get into a lot of delightful trouble around the school. And so that's what got me started. But after a while, became clear that I needed a stronger plot. And so I wrote a new student into the class, and Sophie started trying to become friends with her. But she had her fixation with the flashlights, and she would do other things that would not give Haley a really good feeling about her, a good impression of her. So again, I thought up several of the best parts of the story in that transitional stage between sleep and wakefulness, or wakefulness and sleep. And this gave me some characteristics that made Sophie not just funny and interesting for her ADHD tendencies, which I never talk to children about at all. I just let it be there because there are kids of all different types in every classroom, and so it's just how she is. But it also made me those moments, you know, when I'm coming in and out of sleep, I thought of many scenes that gave Sophie a very big and warm heart. So that's another endearing part of her.
Great. Thank you, Eileen. That was wonderful. Our next speaker is KAH-LAN. She is the author of Crwth's first young adult title, Faster Than Truth. It's a novel that covers some serious issues. The book came out in 2019, almost exactly a year ago, in fact. But it remains timely as it explores the role of media in our understanding of our world and the impact that media has on mental health. And that's something I think we're all thinking a lot more about these days. I'm just going to forward through to Kim's book cover. And Kim, can you tell us a little bit about how you draw from current events in your novels and why storytellers might want to do this and how they could go about doing it?
Okay, yeah, so I think that actually writers have always drawn from current events and societal issues for their stories. Like if you think back to Charles Dickens writing about orphans and workhouses, or Anna Sewell writing about Black Beauty, and you know, as a response to that book, the SPCA was formed. So I think that writers today are continuing that tradition. Virtually every difficult experience that young people can encounter has been tackled by writers of fiction. But like most authors, I don't have firsthand experience of the situation faced by my characters. But I think, you know, like for myself and other writers of contemporary fiction, we're often touched about hearing about a particular event or a societal issue, and we feel compelled to write about it. So for me to get started, I usually spend quite a bit of time researching and pondering, because even though a novel is a work of fiction, I also believe it needs to be true. So, and then from there, the how for me is usually to immerse the character in a situation or a struggle. And for example, like in Faster Than Truth, I was inspired because I saw how often the profession of journalism was being vilified. And I decided to dig into that and chose to write from the point of view of an aspiring young journalist. And looking at it through that lens gave me the perspective I needed to tell a story, as opposed to, say, a biography. And also I feel like that fiction can free the character from any political label and let the story speak to a wider audience. I think that another popular way to fictionalize current events is through works of fantasy. So there's a lot of wonderful fantasy books where the authors have drawn from past or current events shaping their world or our world. And they use symbolism and metaphor to strike that chord of recognition in their readers. But I think, you know, no matter how we approach it, the reason why we do that is because we want to better understand our times and shine a light on issues that concern us. I think that, you know, we're all living through an enormous current event right now with this COVID-19 pandemic, and it's kind of stopped me in my tracks for my current work in progress, because suddenly it didn't feel like reality anymore. So I think it's taking, you know, could take writers some time to sort of adapt to and adjust or incorporate that into their storytelling, because we do live in a sort of changed world. And I'll leave it at that.
Melanie, you're muted.
Thank you, Kim. Our next speaker is James McCann. He's the author of The Three Spartans, which came out last fall. The Three Spartans is a middle grade reader, which is a humorous retelling of the Battle of Thermopylae, which I may have just mispronounced. James, you use a rather unique tool, I guess we would call it, to develop plot, character, and setting. Do you want to tell us a little about this? Oh, James, where are you? Huh. Well, maybe we will come back. I can see he's here. But I cannot hear him. Okay, we're gonna move on and we may come back to James. So let's move along to Laura. Laura is the author of No Right Thing, which is a young adult novel that just came out last month. It's a character-driven novel about a young woman coming into her own, coming to terms with her past and finding her voice. Laura uses some interesting techniques in her development of character. Laura, would you like to speak about that? And Laura is still muted. Let me unmute her.
Thank you. Thanks, Melanie. That's great. I find writing, in the beginning at least, I'm often thinking about character. I think about sort of theme and that sort of thing, but my stories tend to start with the main character. And in order to get into a character's head, I do a lot of things, but one of the things I do is something called the character diamond, and I'm visual, so I actually have notebooks and notes and things on my computer, but I have hard copy, and I do a diamond. And if you think of a diamond having facets and sides, we as people all have different sides to our characters. And so I take 4 sides and I look at four elements: a primary characteristic, a secondary characteristic, and they need to conflict for good tension in the story, and a non-negotiable characteristic, a hill to die on, and a flaw. So for Kate, I had her primary characteristic, her North Star, what drives her. She always tries to do the right thing. Her secondary characteristic, she is afraid of disappointing people, and they can be in conflict sometimes quite naturally, and they worked well for this story. Her non-negotiable hill to die on is that she must look out for others. She feels that it's important as humans that we care for each other. And so this is something that is a non-negotiable thing for her. She has her flaw, we all have lots of them, and one of her biggest flaw that's going to be challenged in the story is that she is afraid to trust. She believes that people always let you down. And that is something that is not necessarily conscious. There's a little bit of it in the beginning of the story that's conscious, and she sort of comes to learn that as she goes. And that's part of her character arc and her growth. As I do the diamond and as I think about character, I also think of archetypes, and this goes back to mythology and the archetypes of people, and I have a number of books that I read about archetypes and things like that and what drives us. And Kate is essentially a rescuer archetype, and so there's a universal lesson there, and that is that she has to learn when to help people and when not to help. So those are sort of the big elements, but I also pepper in I've got it in green, the little sort of seasoning things, and Kate loves to cook. She wants to be a chef, and she does try to please people through her food. She actually thinks of people that she loves and her close friends sort of sometimes in terms of food. If they were a food, what would they be? And her dad's partner, Parker, she thinks of him as macaroni and cheese because he's comforting and he's reassuring and he's always there and she can count on him. Of course, there's other things too. She's secretive at times and she's pragmatic. But I do find that the diamond, coming up with the facets of the personality and knowing what their archetype is and what their universal lesson is, really helps me in sort of developing the story. So that gives you sort of a picture of one element of the writing for me.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura. That was really interesting. I hadn't heard of the character diamond before hearing about it from you. It sounds like James's technology difficulties have been resolved. I'm going to unmute him here. James, do you want to say something so we know we got you?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Woohoo.
So
all right.
We'll go back to your cover, the three Spartans. So everybody heard me talk about your unique tool. So why don't you just dive in and tell us about the tool that you use to build your stories?
Sure. So the tool that I use to build my stories is actually based on a game that I got interested in when I was 11 years old. So when I was 11, I started playing this game called Dungeons and Dragons. Some of you may be familiar with it. In case you're not, it's basically a storytelling game where you have a group of people, usually no more than 4 or 5, and one of them will tell the story of plot, setting, character, and then all of the other players will actually play the characters. So you're each telling a story, all contributing to it. And so that gave me the idea of how to create plot, characters, setting. And in writing the three Spartans, I was actually on a road trip, and I decided to take a road that I'd never taken before. I was driving along, and I wound up in this little town called Birch Bay. And it was this really beautiful cottage town. I went to a coffee shop. I sat down in this at this table, and I was having my coffee. And I was actually working on a historical Greek battle that I thought was going to become my sort of next story. And then I was watching this group of kids who they've been riding their bikes. They just met. They very clearly hadn't seen each other in a year, and they're, some of them were glad to see each other. There was obviously some tension with some of them. And I actually started wondering to myself, well, what would happen if the ancient Greeks, instead of using shields and swords, what if they had paintballs? And what if, instead of it being set in ancient Greece, what if I set this story here in this little town? And so I started going back every weekend and writing this story as not as an ancient story, but as a modern day story, but taking ancient elements into it. And it was all based on the idea of Dungeons and Dragons, where I came up with the setting first, I came up with maps, and then I came up with characters. And then from that, the story kind of evolved. And that was how I used Dungeons and Dragons to write Three Spartans.
That's great. I know my D&D friends had a lot of fun with that, and my D&D partner had a lot of fun making a video for you. Okay, now back to my notes. So we have covered all of the currently available books from Crwth Press. Our next speaker has a book coming out in September, and we'll just skip ahead here. There's Laura's book again. This book, The Fifth Beethoven, is a mystery, and it's a timely release because this year is Beethoven's 250th birthday. The author is Melanie Jackson. I've worked with her for years, and I never get over the strangeness of addressing a Melanie. So Melanie, you've told me that your stories always start with 2 elements. Can you tell everyone what those 2 elements are and why they are so important to your process? And wait till I've unmuted you to speak. Yes, you're unmuted.
All right. And to make it harder with us, we're both MJs too.
Mm-hmm.
So, all right, Melanie J. This is the two elements that I have to have in my mind at the same time, right from the start, to get the story going, are protagonist and setting. So first, the protagonist, I have to be in the protagonist's mind and skin, and this involves knowing what are they passionate about. For me, life is about all the things that we're interested in, right? So if I get the protagonist's passion, their interest in life, then I'm well on the way to knowing them. In the past, and you will be familiar with this since you edited most of my books, I've had characters who were runners, baseball players. There was a cook, a climber, a singer. And in the Fifth Beethoven, my protagonist's passion is playing the piano, playing Beethoven in a rock and roll style. So much like me in my piano playing, what he lacks in training, he makes up for in enthusiasm. So also the protagonist must have attitude, because a goody-goody, a milquetoast type of person would be boring. And this, and thinking about what I was going to talk about, I remembered back to when I was about 9 years old, and I used to read all the Nancy Drews ever that were available. I love Nancy Drew, but maybe after a year of devouring every single Nancy Drew, I realized that there was a problem with her, which was that she was perfect. She was never restless, never upset, never stressed, never a hair out of place. It's just beautiful young woman confidently solving all the problems. And so I realized that's actually, oh, there she is. This is actually a classic mystery, although she is flawless. That's the only problem. So I realized that my addiction to Nancy was waning because she is perfect. So I wanted to make sure that my protagonists have strong feelings, strong reactions. Maybe they wisecrack out of humor or bitterness. And this is fun for me because it makes for snappy inner thoughts and snappy dialogue, which is what I really enjoy. But they can't just be a nice person with an interest. They have to have a flaw, of course. So I'm thinking of past flaws. I've imbued my protagonist with tactlessness, maybe being too blunt, maybe not thinking about other people's feelings. In the Fifth Beethoven, my protagonist, he is a rather impatient, but his big flaw, and this is one I definitely have been through myself when younger, is that he has a very starry-eyed view. He's devoted to this wealthy real estate magnate who's given him a summer gig playing piano in the courtyard of this beautiful new building the developer has put up, the magnate. So this young man, well, he's 15, he just adores this guy. I mean, who wouldn't? This guy gives you a big break. You're maybe not that talented yet, but he's letting you play piano. He just adores him. This is his flaw. So even when there are protesters in the courtyard of this building who are protesting about being rent-evicted, this guy whose name is Nate, he's very impatient with them. Why can't everyone see how great this developer is? So the setting is then generally setting has to be compatible with the protagonist's interests. So in this case, the main setting is the courtyard of this building, which is shaped like a quarter note. And so protesters are on the periphery, and this guy's playing like mad. He loves to play loudly. He's very enthusiastic. There are also costumed Beethovens wandering around, giving brochures for handing out brochures. But one of the costumed Beethovens is a thief. And that's where the mystery comes in. The other setting that I have is a costume company where my protagonist ends up being trapped. I had a lot of fun with that scene. So these settings are, setting is very important. Protagonist, I do find that once I have those, the story flows. I have the problem in mind, the conflict, and the story does flow. I'll just say one last thing, which is that I always tell kids this in schools, that if they're thinking of a setting, the classic mystery setting might be a graveyard or some really scary place with reptiles crawling around or something like that. But those are cliches, and I have to pay tribute to Alfred Hitchcock, the master of suspense, because he sort of thumbed his nose at all these cliched settings and proved that you can make any setting exciting. He did this in his movie North by Northwest, one of his classic suspense scenes where there's a setting of a prairie, just a flat prairie. So that, you're thinking, oh, prairie setting, sorry for you prairie people, but it's kind of a yawner, right? Just how boring can that be? And he has a crop dusting plane come out of the sky and try and attack Cary Grant. And so it's he's saying anything can be exciting, even this supposedly dull setting. So So the plane comes down and there's just a, oh, good gracious. Okay, on that explosive finish, I will conclude. Thank you very much. I really had fun with this. Now there's poor Cary Grant, my goodness.
Thank you, Melanie. That is a great explosive finish. So our next speaker is the newest addition to the Crwth family. Emma Pedersen has illustrated a book that's coming out in the fall. The book is called KAH-LAN and the Stink Ink. And it's a story about a sea otter who has a harrowing adventure. The book presented a lot of challenges in terms of illustration because we asked Emma to avoid anthropomorphizing while at the same time infusing KAH-LAN and his friends with character. So Emma, can you tell us a little bit about the technical side of the character design process you went through with KAH-LAN? And as a little surprise for Emma, she doesn't know which two illustrations I chose to include here. So I will unmute her. Hi, Emma.
Hi. Yeah, so this was a little different than normal, well, not normal, but typical character design that I've normally done, where there was a little more accuracy needed. So, you know, we needed to know like that the otters were young, but not too young, and they're not fully adult otters. So like there was a certain amount of character design that could happen, but also they really just needed to look like sea otters. So for this, it was more not so much using shape language as much as taking direct reference from like photographs and videos that I was provided with and looked at myself. Yeah, it was like a little challenging, but I think it worked out pretty well in the end. As you can see, like in the faces, I kind of kept more of the, I guess, anthropomorphic look where like the eyes have that slightly human quality and faces show like a little bit of emotion where like you wouldn't really see that in animals so much. But I think it worked out pretty well. I like to think so.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the other illustration that Emma did. Do you want to talk about this? This one's a favorite.
Yeah, I like this one. So, I mean, we didn't want to, there was feedback a few times about making sure the otters didn't have like a smile, which is fair. But also kind of showing like, in this image specifically, like a kind of peaceful sereneness, sort of, with also still like knowing that this is sort of like a calm period of the like time in the story. So yeah, like I didn't want it to look like kind of blank expressions, but more like just peaceful. So that was kind of like a fine line to walk of like no smiles, or didn't, you know, it doesn't look like there's a smile, but still have like a furry face, pretty much.
Great, thanks, Emma. So through having each of you talk about the thing that you're most interested in, it's great. We covered almost all of the aspects of storytelling. But we haven't touched on theme at all. And I'm wondering if I can call upon a couple of you to talk about at what point in your process does theme start to become, at what point does it emerge? When do you start thinking about it as a writer? And James, I've unmuted you first, so.
Sure. So for me, theme comes out, I would say, in the second or even the third draft. So my first draft really is just, it's writing the story, it's giving the characters problems that they need to solve, and giving them choices. And I think giving our characters choices is actually where theme comes from. So after you have written that first draft or that second draft and you're reading through it, you really start to see what themes are emerging from it. And for myself, I'll usually pick whichever one I think is the most interesting. And then in the subsequent drafts, then I highlight those themes to make it, you know, that's the major or the minor theme. But for me, theme is a byproduct of writing the story and what happens with the characters.
That's great. Yeah, that's I think a fairly common approach. And I want to pick on K.L. Denman here, because we talked about her book being about an issue and current events, but there's a real distinction between that and theme. And so I think we should hear from Kim about how she approaches theme. If I can get her unmuted. There we go.
Yes, so I think in some ways similar to what Jane said, that sometimes the theme will emerge as you're working on the story, because even though you may have a plot and an idea for a story, and I probably work more, I'm more of a pantser, like Kristen mentioned. I don't often have an outline, although when I have outlined, I found it pretty nice to be able to work off of that. It wasn't such a scary process, but the theme itself seems to come sort of emerge from the story. Let's say what happens with the characters, especially when there's sort of those surprises with their characters as their character is built, as things happen in the story. So I think that it was like Stephen King who, on writing, when he said that if you go back after you've finished your first draft, and then maybe you put it aside for a bit and get some readers, and then you go back and read again, there you will see sometimes a theme emerge, and then you can work on building that using more symbolism or metaphor, and just pull that theme out a little bit more strongly.
That's great. Thank you, Melanie. Kim. Sorry. Thank you, Kim. That's I'm really glad that you brought up the Stephen King novel, because that's one, or the Stephen King book on writing, because that's one that I have recommended to many new and experienced writers alike. I think he's got a lot of really great advice in that book. I'd like to hear a little bit about illustration and theme, and I'm going to pick on Emma Pedersen. How do you work on bringing out theme through illustration, Emma?
Usually that'll come out for me typically in color and like tone. That usually start, like in the illustration process, that will usually start through like storyboarding. So, well, when it's just with storyboarding, that's more like sketches. So also shapes and things like that. So there's like, if it's a story with some suspense, or like a moment in the story where there's some like fear or something like that, if we're making one object really big compared to maybe the protagonist or little character in a story, then that kind of thing can convey theme. Yeah, mostly like those kind of visual tools.
Fantastic. Thanks, Emma. That's really interesting. I think a lot more about the writing process than the illustration, and I still feel very much like a spectator on the illustration side of things. It's always fascinating to hear the process. So I want to talk a little bit about readers. Everyone here writes, presumably, with the idea that people will read your stories and enjoy them. And that requires some understanding of how people will receive your work. That's a little bit the job of an editor, but I personally recommend, before sending anything to an editor, that you take your manuscript to someone you trust and ask them for some feedback. So I'd like to ask some of you what you do in that regard, and I'll start with Elleen.
Yes, so I have several people I depend upon to be my first readers. In 2002, I attended the BC Festival of the Arts literary program as a jury selected delegate, and I met 9 other authors. Andrea Spalding, the author, was sort of teaching us things if we didn't already know them. And those people, several of those people got together with me, and we formed an online critiquing group that has been one of the best things that could ever happen to me as a writer. One of them is here today. Hi, Lorraine. Lorraine Kemp is demanding. She gets an idea, and I'm forced to reassess my writing because I don't want to let that girl down. She's just wonderful as a critiquer. Karen Audio, who wrote the KAH-LAN and the Stink Ink and several other books. Karen is another one in our little merry group, and she has an amazing way of heading you in the right direction when you've wandered off like a stray lamb. And she'll just sort of gently nudge you with, as if she's got something soft in her hand, like a giant Q-tip, or maybe the head of a stuffed hobby horse. So you're not like, you know, you don't suffer from her. She makes her points clearly, but she does it gently. Then there's Pat Fraser, who is the voice of experience. She's got all sorts of, you know, she speaks kindly, and she's got, you know, all sorts of, she comes at things from a different angle. And then there's Marianne Thompson, author, editor, who, when she's with the group, she is amazing because she sees the bigger picture. I'm always in awe of that. Anyone who can see this bigger picture and share it with me and make sure that I'm on the right track. So that's the value of critiquing groups. I also belong just more recently to Shoreline Writers Group in Coquitlam. We meet at the Coquitlam Public Library, and there's some great writers in there. And my other huge group, hugely important to me, I've been in the Port Moody Kyle Center writers groups, plural, because we have different facilitators. I've been in those groups for, believe it or not, 24 years. And they are wonderful, from the facilitators to all of the authors. I don't dare name one, because then I'll have to name maybe 2 or 3 dozen. So it's really great. We're meeting online right now, but it doesn't quite have the intensity or, you know, in-person intensity to meet online, but thankfully I can still connect with them right at this difficult time.
That's great. Thanks, Eileen. Now, I know that Kim Denman is in a writer's group as well. I'm just going to unmute Kristen, because I don't actually know if you have early readers. Kristen.
Well, I have a few avenues I go to help me make sense of my early writing. I also belong to a critique group. There are 7 of us in the group, and we meet every 2 weeks. Everybody sends out a piece of writing ahead of time. We do a written critique of it, and then we all meet, and we have tea. You have to have tea, because you can't critique without tea. And we have tea, and we critique each other's work. What's so lovely about this group is that everybody's a writer. Everybody has been published one way or another. And everybody has a different take on things. So you won't always get the same feedback. If something's not right, you'll get the same feedback. But somebody may focus on one thing, somebody will focus on something else. And people make really, really good points. And it's a kind group. If something's wrong, they'll let you know, but they're also very kind, and you don't ever feel like you're being attacked, so that's wonderful. And I've had so much valuable information come from that group. 2 readers that I've had just about the entire time I've been writing. One was my mother. She passed away about 6 years ago. But she always read my stuff. But she would say, Kristen, she said, I'm not a writer. I don't know this stuff. And I said, Mom, you're a reader, and I'm writing for readers. And so, and I very much valued her opinion because she wasn't nice. My mother wasn't nice. She was honest, and honest was what I was looking for. If it turned out to be nice, that was a bonus, you know, but there was that. And the other person who's always read my stuff is my daughter. And I value her opinion a great deal as well. And though she's usually encouraging in her critiques, she also isn't afraid to say where she doesn't think this works. And the one thing that she tells me all the time with every book, it doesn't matter what I write, it's not long enough, Mom. It's not long enough. Well, I don't have my mom anymore to read my stuff, but now I have one of my granddaughters. And the book that's coming out in the fall, she read it. She just turned 10, and she read the early work, and she loved it. And she's part of the target audience, I guess. So that's really encouraging. And one of the things I know she's going to be a great person to read my stuff is that she said, well, I won't tell you what she said because it'll give away part of the story. We can't have any spoilers there. But she asked me a question that made me know that the story was longer than just the one book, and that there have to be 2 more to get the whole story done. So those are my readers.
That is some very useful feedback. Okay, so I have quite a long list of other questions here, and we are over time. So I'll just ask one more, and that is about revisions. So we've talked about getting a reader to read your book, and presumably what happens after you have a first reader is they have some feedback for you. You have to do some revisions. So I'm just curious how many revisions some of you do. So I'm going to start with Laura Langston here.
I had to laugh. I don't keep track. I revise. I love revising, actually. Probably enjoy revising. Well, I was going to say more than cold writing, but I like getting the story down too. I will revise as long as it takes the story as many times as it takes to get the story to where I want it to be. And that varies. And it can depend on feedback. I have readers as well. I will usually revise after first readers, both writers and non-writers. I try to get feedback from both, as Kristen does. And I will revise then, but I'm quite particular. So it's not unusual for me to do 4 or 5, 2 to 3 to 4 runs through a book before I'll even send it off to a publisher. Depends. Picture books I've revised 10, 15 times sometimes before I sent them off. A lot of revising. I like it, and I think it's necessary. And then I enjoy it after getting the editorial feedback, because it's something I just love to do.
Yeah, that's great. I'm going to ask one more person the same question. Melanie Jackson, we haven't heard much from you in a bit. So do you want to take this one?
Sure, thank you. Okay, I actually really like editing, and when I teach a mystery unit every spring, and the kids look at me in horror and bewilderment when I say I love editing, but I tell them, because I do, like others have said, revise a lot. And to me, it's like, so you get your first draft, and then it's like you see the whole landscape below you, and you realize you have to move this thing here, or maybe take that one out, or add something. I really enjoy editing. It's so I do it quite a lot, and definitely I do that before I show this story to anyone. I think was it James Joyce who said that everything's in editing. I may be misquoting or misattributing that to him, but oh, sorry, it's James Joyce. I have a helpful, one of my readers here sent me a little message. It's James Joyce said, there's no such thing as writing, only rewriting. And I really believe that once the first draft is done, or even sometimes I stop and go back when I'm in the writing. It's just the rewriting that I really like a lot. It's just, so for kids who are afraid of editing, I say, no, it's actually quite fun. It's as bizarre as that sounds.
Okay, that's great. I have to tell our viewers that I did not actually know I was going to get those answers from Melanie and Laura. I think revision is really important. I'm an editor, so I have to think that it's important, but
Sure.
I was very pleased to hear those answers. So we are at almost 20 after 5. So I think we're going to wrap up. I'm going to switch this over to gallery view, so that viewers can see all of you at once. Thank you, everybody, for all of your fantastic answers.
Thank you.
And thank you, everybody who tuned in and stuck with us despite our technical issues. And if you are interested in learning more about any of these authors, you can go to our website, which is www.crwth.ca, and we have an authors and illustrators page with information about each and every one of these people and a couple more who couldn't make it today. And I do encourage you to look them up, engage with their work, check out their books, and keep watching the Crwth blog, because I did get some wonderful responses from these wonderful writers about their process that didn't make it into the talk. So I'm probably going to combine that into a blog post or two that'll be shared within the next couple of weeks. And this is now the awkward moment in every Zoom call where everyone says goodbye and then we just disappear. Bye.
Goodbye.